all I have suffered by constantly risking my life in battle has left me no better off than anyone else. As a bird brings every morsel she finds to her unfledged chicks, however hard it goes with her, so I have spent many a sleepless night and fought through many a bloody day, battling with men for the sake of women. Hello everyone and welcome back to my novel review, the book podcast. My name is Seamus. Thanks so much for clicking on. If you have just wandered into my little corner of the podcasting or YouTube world, thank you so much for coming aboard. Today we are exploring Homer's The Iliad. This is part one of a two-part series, and you probably guessed it, next week is going to be the Odyssey, which is very, very cool. So make sure you hang around for that. But as always, if you would like to like and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate that. But as always, this is a free podcast. So yeah, let's just sit back and hopefully enjoy the show. Okay, let's get into the belly of the beast. Homer's The Iliad, one of my favorite stories of all time. I think it is a fantastic story. Emphasis on the story. I do think it is perhaps a bit more a work of fiction than historical fact, but I will speak about that a bit later in the episode. But yeah, one of the great stories. I think I've read this 4 times now. I think I've listened to it twice and read it twice. I had to do it for university when I was there studying a bit of ancient history and a bit of archaeology, so that was incredibly fun. This book, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're 2 books that make up part of a sort of larger story, the epic cycle as it is known. However, the incredibly sad thing is these are the only 2 books that remain from the epic cycle. We have fragments that sort of tell us what the other sort of stories would have been composed of and detailed, but these are the only 2 stories that we have completely in the flesh that detail a solid chunk of story. The Iliad is a story that details a couple of weeks in the 10th year of the war, the Trojan War famously being 10 years long. And yeah, this story picks up a couple of weeks into the 10th year. So it's really a very brief snapshot into what was an incredibly large story. And if you have only sort of heard of the story or watched perhaps the 2004 making of Troy, the film starring Brad Pitt and Eric Bana, and of course Orlando Bloom as Paris in his little hot run there, you'd probably be surprised at where the story of the Iliad actually finishes. And I mean, this is a spoiler, but it's not really a spoiler because the story is like, what, 3,000 years old? It actually just ends after the death of Hector, and we never get that incredible scene, or 2 incredible scenes, I should say, of Achilles dying and the Trojan horse being wheeled into Troy, and I guess how they managed to penetrate the famed walls of Troy with the use of a Trojan horse, which is, yeah, incredibly sad, but of course we're just incredibly grateful to at least have these 2 great stories from that particular time period, a time period where so much was lost. So the story was originally orally comprised. I do have a little video speaking about the paradox of oral composition if you do want to watch that, but I am going to speak about it now here anyway. So there is a paradox to oral composition, but of course, what is oral composition in the first instance? Oral composition was a way of telling a story back in these days, sort of the 12th century BC, and it's a time period where no one was writing anything down for one reason or the other. We don't really have a solid answer as to why that was. There are theories here and there, but basically nothing was being written down, and so all stories and all sort of all stories at this particular time were just being orally comprised. They were performed by bards that went town to town. So there is a paradox to things being orally comprised. The wonderful thing about oral composition is that it means texts are incredibly flexible, they're incredibly fluid, they're incredibly changeable. And what I mean by that is, if you had a story about a farmer and you were going as a bard to a town, let's just call it town A, and this town was a town of cow farmers, you could change that story of the farmer to be reflective of that town and be about cow farming. You then, as the bard, tell the story for a few nights, entertain a few people, hopefully get a bit of money and move on to the next town. Let's call that town B. The next town is a town of sheep farmers. So what do you do to make the story more accessible, more enjoyable, more participatory from those listening to the story, that they can understand it and accessible? You change the story to be about sheep farming, not cow farming. And so the story always has, I guess, the roots or the foundations of what the story is, but everything else is flexible within the framework of what is designed. So that's what an orally comprised story is. It's something where there's kind of like foundations to the story, but everything else can be flexible, of course, to a certain degree to exude that certain level of flexibility to make it more accessible to who it's being performed to. There was another advantage to stories being incredibly flexible, is that if you're a bard telling this story and you come to a town and they're absolutely loving the story, you can just extend the story for as long as you want, night after night, expanding, going into more detail here and there. Whereas if you're in a town and they're not really vibing with it and you're like, oh, I just got to sort of wrap this story up, get out of here and hopefully find another town that is going to love the story, you can do that too. You can cut it short. So the stories are incredibly flexible, and it's an incredibly beautiful way to tell a story because of this flexibility, because of this fleeting nature of the story, this really ephemeral nature of the story itself, which of course is beautiful and quite reminiscent to, you know, the human experience, in that we are all eventually going to die and our time here is limited and we only get one go of it. So incredibly beautiful in that sense. The paradox comes in, of course, when it is eventually written down, because once it is written down, it loses all flexibility. It loses everything that made it technically this beautiful story. But of course, the paradox comes in that we actually want it technically to be written down, and the fact that it's written down a few hundred years later in around the 8th century BC by this famed Homer, the fact that it is written down is, for us now, incredibly cool and important, because we now have this story that captures a snapshot of what life was potentially like back then in those days. Another really great example of this kind of like paradox is Pompeii, the archaeological site. The reason Pompeii is such an incredibly famous archaeological site is because it was just performing as a regular town on the day it was completely covered up and destroyed and in effect preserved by the Mount Vesuvius eruption. And what that means is, you know, people were just going about their daily business on the day that everything sort of fell apart and the day that the lava started to flow. And so what it means is that everything is pretty much more or less perfectly preserved and a clear snapshot as to what life was genuinely like at that time period. I'm talking, they know, you know, foods that were on offer, buildings, architectural standards, artistic standards, how streets were laid out, what was in use, you know, what's actually being sold in the shops. There's, of course, the incredibly famous brothel that's still got pictures of the sex acts on the wall. And these are all incredibly important things. They might not reveal truth that we didn't already know, but they do provide a clear point in time now when they were clearly there. And so we can sort of date pre and post Pompeii. And the reason it is so, I guess, lucky in a very, you know, not lucky sense, because a lot of people died for this to happen. But the reason it's incredibly lucky is because naturally towns like this would ebb and flow with the turning of time. You know, buildings would go up, buildings would come down, building standards would change, people would change. The town might go through a period of war where it's completely ravaged and decimated and looted, and so it loses a lot of stuff. You know, walls get blown up, all this kind of thing. And so the face of the city would naturally change, as all faces of all cities do constantly change in the modern day and have done through all human history. So to actually have this town of Pompeii completely preserved to that particular day is incredibly rare and incredibly important, because we get a genuine snapshot. And that's the paradox with this text as well, is that we've lost that flexibility. We've lost the fact that, you know, if this story hadn't been written down, it would have continued to continually evolve and change as history went on, to the point that the story might even be completely unrecognizable today if it had not been written down to what it was when it was written down in the 8th century. So that's the paradox, in that you don't want to lose that beauty, but obviously in the process of losing that beauty, we gained this fantastic story that is now preserved for later generations such as ourselves to read and study. So speaking of the story itself, is there any kind of truth we can actually withdraw from the story itself? You know, there is the famous historian Heinrich Schliemann, who of course went to locate the fallen city of Troy in the fields of Ilium, which is why it's called the Iliad. And he has, you know, reportedly found what they think is Troy. And so obviously from this story, you are able to draw some truth, some fact from it. And there is always going to be fact, even if it is a fiction story, that you can draw from it, even some kind of social fact that you can draw from it. Think of modern day sitcoms, in that they will always elucidate an element of truth as to what society is like at the current moment of filming and writing, you know, in terms of language used, fashion being worn, words being used, technology being used, what's being actually done in their day-to-day lives. These are all things that, even though it's a fiction story and it's completely made up and enjoyable, made for our entertainment, they are unconsciously elucidating truths to our everyday lives that, historians and future generations might actually study as to understand what we were like in this current day, in this current climate. And one example of this actually is Modern Family, the TV show. If anyone's ever watched that, there is I believe it's season 2 or 3, I think it's season 2, where for one episode, Phil wants an iPad, and it's the launch of the first ever iPad. And of course, it's a fictional story, but because it's obviously commentating on things that are culturally relevant at the time, this is a true historical fact that appears within the show. And so the show came out in, I don't know what it was, 2008 or something, when the first iPad came out, and season 2 came out. You can then more or less peg the date of the iPad coming out based on when that show was released. So that's what I mean by kind of like drawing social fact from a story like this. That being said, there is also, I think it's the second chapter, it's entitled A Dream, a Testing, and the Catalogue of Ships. And basically it's, I'd probably say, one of the tougher chapters of the book in terms of entertainment, because they are more or less just going through different contingents. So the contingent from Argos contained man from the towns of Argos and well-watered Tirans, from Hermione and from the Essene with their deep gulfs, from the Troezen, from Ione. And so it's just listing. It's basically, this entire chapter is just listing different things. The contingent from Mycenae contained men from, and then it just goes on and list. And from that, we are able to see sort of what towns fell under what particular, kingdoms of the day, and who was ruling those particular kingdoms. So we are able to draw a decent amount of truth. But as I said, it's more or less, in my opinion, a fictional story. So the story is originally laid out in dactylic hexameter, which is a meter of epic poetry, very particular to this point in time. It's pretty standard. We don't get a whole lot of that sort of rhythmic heartbeat of the story, because this is, of course, now translated into English, so we do lose some of the beauty there. That being said, if you are able to listen to this story, I know for a fact, because I've listened to it as well, Spotify, if you have Spotify Premium, they actually have a really good rendition of Homer's The Iliad, and the Odyssey as well, actually, to be fair. But the Iliad in particular, of a man, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, actually reading the Iliad, narrating the Iliad, and it is incredibly beautiful because he does have a wonderful rhythm to the story, but it doesn't have the same kind of beauty that the dactylic hexameter would have had if you're reading it in its original language. But that being said, yeah, I mean, it is a story that is made to be spoken and to be digested out loud. So if you do have the opportunity, I think it is a more enjoyable and rich reading experience to actually listen to it and not read it. And I think it's more enjoyable for that sense because it is a cozy, I think it does have a cozy quality that is able to lull you and ferry you along listening to it. Whereas if you're reading it, I think it does have, it would feel maybe a bit more stagnant. There is a lot of repetition in this, and that's the nature of the orally comprised text, but I think listening to it does have that kind of rhythmic beauty, still holds essence and antecedents of the rhythmic beauty that made it such an enjoyable story. Just touching now upon, I guess, the repetition that I was just talking about. There is, as I said, generally foundations that the bard would have had for this story, rhythmic beats and plot points throughout the story that would have kept them on track. But then, of course, they've got to fill in everything else in between. So I'm actually going to read to you 2 quotes about Paris getting dressed and then Achilles getting dressed, and you can be the judge if you can hear any similarities in how it's told. So this is Paris, first and foremost. Then, godlike Paris, husband of lovely-haired Helen, put on his magnificent armour. First he placed fine leg guards on his shins, fitted with silver ankle clips. Then he put on body armour. It belonged to his brother Lycaon, and fitted him too. Over his shoulder he slung a bronze, silver riveted sword and then a great heavy shield. On his mighty head he placed a well-made helmet with horsehair crest, the plume nodding frighteningly from the top. Then he took up a powerful spear that fitted his grip. So that was Paris. And now, at pretty much the complete opposite end of the story, we have Achilles putting on some armor, and it reads like this. First he placed fine leg guards on his shins, fitted with silver ankle clips. Then he put on his body armor and slung his bronze, silver riveted sword over his shoulder. Then he took up the great heavy shield whose brightness flashed in the distance like the moon's. Like the gleam that sailors catch at sea from a fire burning on a lonely upland farm when the winds drive them unwillingly from home over the teeming seas. Such was the gleam that went up into the sky from Achilles' ornamented shield. Next he picked up his massive helmet and placed it on his head. It sparkled like a star, and above it danced the golden plumes that Hephaestus had lavished on the crest. Godlike Achilles tried himself in the armor to see if it fitted and allowed his splendid limbs free movement. And so you can see it's a little bit different there, and this is what I'm talking about in the flexibility of it, but it's more or less exactly the same as well. And so there's that foundation there, armor being put on is always told the same way, but it's embellished in a different sense depending on who's putting on the armor. We've got that lovely passage there about the sailors at sea catching fire, burning on a lonely upland farm when the wind drives them unwillingly from home over the teeming seas. Lovely visualization of language there, but just a little bit more embellished because it's Achilles and he's a much bigger character, much more famous character, and so it would have been a much bigger scene as Achilles finally adorns his armor for the Trojan War. So just in that passage, I also want to highlight just the complete beauty of the language there. It's incredibly vivid. I mean, the story is incredibly brutal. It's incredibly beautiful. It's incredibly vivid. It's full of pride, jealousy, kindness, kinship. Like there are just so many different human emotions going on. I think what I love most about this story is that there are just large sweeping battle scenes that last page after page, and then there are intense conversations between two characters that are just so personal and prideful, and it just delves so much into, I guess, man as a collective in these large sweeping scenes as they try ravage these different towns, to then all of a sudden the intensely personal as we understand why different characters are doing different things. And that's more or less what I think wonderful about this story is there's kind of like an overarching comedic value to it, and it's the story of Achilles is pretty much more or less fed up with this war at this stage because he has been, as I read in that opening quote to the episode, he has been out there in the fields fighting. He's bloody. He is being brutal. He is conquering and killing and trying to win a war. And as part of this, he has claimed a woman as his property, which is problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. But he's claimed her as his property, and he says he loves her. And then the king Agamemnon comes in and claims Achilles' bride, his prize, as his own. And that just really annoys Achilles, which, I think I love it because on one hand, it's like, well, I don't really agree with it on any sense because you shouldn't be able to own any kind of human being and be able to conquer and just claim human beings. But on the other sense, I completely understand Achilles' point of view because it's very reminiscent, if you're reading it in a modern context, of the workers doing all the job and then the managers claiming all the profits and the glory for themselves. So it just kind of highlights the timeless nature of the Iliad and the timeless nature of these stories and how they still speak to us in the modern context. But I think what I find most enjoyable about this story is just sort of the overarching storyline of Achilles has more or less stopped work because Agamemnon has taken his girl and he's fed up with that. He's fed up of, having to do all the grunt work with someone else just sitting back at his ship, taking all the glory and claiming all the prize for himself. And there's this wonderful passage where they, a lot of people come to treat with Achilles to try and get him to fight because he's, of course, one of, if not the most famous warrior. He's definitely the most famous warrior alive at this point in time. And having him on the battlefield really changes the tides of the war itself. And so the fact that he stepped back from the war is like a really big scene, and it's a really big, it's the chief tension of this story. The fact that Achilles is just like, nope, I've had enough. I'm sick of doing all the work and getting none of the glory. I earned my woman, I earned my bride, I earned this woman that I won, and I deserve her. But Agamemnon has other plans, and he just wants to sit there, one of the fat cats on his ship, and do none of the work and claim all the goods. And so a lot of people come to treat with Achilles, and then there's this one fabulous line. The chapter is the embassy to Achilles, and it says, "But you, Achilles, the gods have worked you up into this implacable fury over a girl, one single girl." And it's probably my favorite line of the entire story because it's kind of like, Achilles, like you're letting everything get in the way. You're letting victory get in the way for this one girl. And of course, for Achilles, it represents a lot more. It's not just one girl. It's the fact that he is it's an incredibly prideful scene. It's the fact that he's out there doing the work and he deserves the recognition. And of course, we can all sympathize with that in a way if it wasn't over, another human life being made a slave. But I think what I love most about that line is, the admission that Achilles has been worked up into an implacable fury over a girl, one single girl. And it's like, hang on, we've been here for 10 years now fighting a war over one girl, Helen of Troy. It's just the most ridiculous line and just the most ridiculous way to try and treat someone to come back to fight for you, because the entire war is being fought for Helen of Troy. Helen that has run away with Paris. This entire war has started because of one girl. So I just found the whole story, it's absolutely wonderful. It's absolutely comedic, but of course it's absolutely brutal. I've done it again. Beautiful and brutal. For me, it's definitely one of those stories that everyone should try, read, or listen to at least once in their lives, because I think it is an incredibly human story. I say that, knowing that the gods are genuinely pretty much on every single page. And if you watched, the 2004 rendition of it, the film with Brad Pitt, you'd think, oh, there's no gods in that film at all, which is, I think, probably one of the great disservices of that film, because, the gods actually play a huge part in the story. They are in nearly every single scene, manipulating people, trying to help people. They're trying to prevent people from winning. It's really fascinating how the gods interact with humanity in the story itself, and that's sort of like this whole other thing as well. But yeah, more or less, it is an incredibly human story. Like I said, there's just these great sweeping passages of war taking place and these humans fighting to the death and fighting for absolute glory. And then there's these incredibly pointillated moments of human emotion being outpoured between characters having conversations, speaking about, these universal themes, like, the fact that we're working and not getting the recognition or the respect we deserve. So, I found it fantastic. The kindness, the kinship, the anger, the pride, the jealousy, the beauty, the brutal nature of it. I absolutely love it. That was Homer's The Iliad. I mean, for me, it's a 5 out of 5. So yeah, check it out. Next week, I will be doing this book, Homer's The Odyssey. Excited to do this one because it's a very different story, very different change of pace. This is, of course, talking about Odysseus's journey home from Ilium, from the Trojan War. And of course, Christopher Nolan is doing a film about this, which is due out next year. So that's also incredibly cool because I'm, excited to see his take on it, but I'll speak more about that next week. Well, if you have made it this far, thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. I really do appreciate it. If you would like to like and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate that. But, here we are at the end of the episode. So hopefully see you next week. And today, to take us away, I think another little quote of Achilles, just sort of proving his point as to why or why not he's fighting. Why did the Greeks have to fight the Trojans? Well, why did the son of Atreus raise an army and bring it here? Was it not for lovely-haired Helen? So are the only men on earth who love their wives these sons of Atreus? No, every decent, right-minded man loves and cherishes his own woman as I love that girl with all my heart, even though she was a war captive. But now he has snatched my prize from my arms and cheated me. Don't let him try his tricks on me again. I know him too well. He won't win me over.